Hello, in today's video, we'll take a look at different narrative modes of thinking, concepts like implied reader and implied author, and also uh, various forms of narration. So, without further ado, we'll go to the first topic, narrative modes of thinking. Now, the human mind has developed various modes of thinking, which are logical and imaginative. And as we had discussed earlier, narration is an important aspect of human life. Now, according to Jerome Bruner, who was a very famous American psychologist, there are two modes of thinking. One is the logical scientific mode, and the second mode is the narrative mode. So, these are the two modes of human thinking according to the American psychologist Jerome Bruner. First one, the logical scientific mode, and the second one, the narrative mode. Now, what do you mean by the logical scientific mode of thinking? It is the scientific way of analyzing an incident. It demands two elements for the completion of meaning. The first element is the cause, and the second element is the effect. So, in logical scientific method, meaning is completed only when you know the cause of an incident. For example, let's take a look at an example, a very famous example. Uh, the tortoise won the race because the hare slept out of overconfidence. Now, the tortoise won. What was the cause for that winning? It's not because of the ability of the tortoise that he won, that it won, but it was because the hare slept out of overconfidence. Now, that is the cause, right? The hare slept out of overconfidence is the cause, and what is the effect? The tortoise won the race because of it. Now, this is a logical scientific method. An event or an incident happened, and you analyze the incident, you look for the cause and the effect. That is the logical scientific method, the first mode of human thinking. In the second mode, in the narrative mode, one action happens and the other follows. Okay, there are no explanations given. A sequence, it's merely a sequential depiction of events. One action happens and the other merely follows. It invites the reader to fill in the gaps left by the narrator, inspiring the reader to imagine the rest of the occurrences. For example, the hare slept and the tortoise won the race. Now, two events. The hare slept, the first event, and the second event, the tortoise winning the race. These two events are given. Now, what was the reason for the hare sleeping? What was the reason for the tortoise winning? These explanations are not given. So it invites the reader to fill in the gaps left by the narrator. You as a reader have the freedom to fill in the gaps. Now, what is left out by the narrator, you can supplement with your imaginative powers, inspiring the reader to imagine the rest of the occurrences. So, this particular sentence can be rewritten in so many different ways with your imaginative power when you're using the narrative mode of thinking. So, these are the two modes of human thinking according to the American psychologist Jerome Bruner. The logical scientific method, which looks for the cause and the effect, and the narrative mode of thinking, which focuses on events and which leaves gaps for the reader to fill in. And we are obviously, as literature students, more interested in the narrative mode of thinking. Now, moving on, textuality and reading. Now, narrators basically are a combination of three components. teller or author, tale or text, addressee or reader. So, see, narration is done either by uh, telling a tale or by writing a tale, right? Writing a story. So, the first component is teller or author, the creator of the narrator. The tale or the text. Tale is the story, text can be a reference to a literary work. Addressee, the person to whom the tale is told, is the addressee. The reader is the one who reads the text. So these are the three components that make a narrative possible. So teller or author, tale or text, addressee or reader. So there's a diagram, and both all these three components are interconnected. You cannot remove one component from this combination and expect it to be complete. Expect a narrative to be complete. If it is to be complete, all these three components are supposed to be there. Now, now we have to look at the concept introduced by the American literary critic, who was more popular as a film critic, Seymour Chapman. Uh, this concept was introduced by Chapman in the year 1978. Uh, uh, he introduced a diagram of narrative communication. Okay. Uh, so this diagram is very useful for us to analyze the processes that are involved in a narrative. Okay. So the process of narratives can be analyzed through the diagram of narrative communication introduced by Seymour Chapman in the year 1978. Now, remember, Seymour Chapman was an American literary and film critic, and he introduced this diagram of narrative communication to help us understand the process of narratives, how narratives are made. Let's take a look at the diagram. Now, there's a real author and there's a real reader. Now, these two thing, the real author, the real reader, and the material that connects the author and the reader, that is the narrative text. These three things are real. Okay, that's why real author and the real reader and the narrative text. These and the narrative text is the common thing that binds the author and the reader, that brings them together. But in between, you see in a box, you see words like implied author, uh, narrator, narratee, and also implied reader. Now, what do you mean by this? Now, a work is written by obviously a real person, a real writer or author, and it is read by, or it's analyzed by a real person, another person in flesh and blood, who's the reader. But according to Chapman, there are other factors that comes into play: the implied author and the implied reader. Now, before we analyze this particular diagram any further, we have to explain what we have to understand what the term implied author actually means. Now, this term implied author was introduced by a literary critic, Wayne C. Booth, in his 1961 work, The Rhetoric of Fiction, to distinguish between the virtual author of the text from the real author. Now, so this term was introduced by Wayne C. Booth in his work The Rhetoric of Fiction, which was published in 1961, to distinguish the virtual author from the real author of the text. That is, see, when an author is writing a work and the work is finished and it reaches the reader, and when the reader is reading that particular literary work, uh, the reader might have certain notions or ideas about the author, and that idea that the reader has will be very different from the actual person who has written the work. Yes, so when you're reading a particular novel, you might feel that okay, this writer might be like this writer might be having such and such characteristics. This might be the psychology or the thought process of the writer, which might or might not be true. See, we do not know the real author in person, so we might not be able into we might not be able to get into the minute details or the psyche of the real author. But when you're reading a particular novel or a short story or any uh, literary work for that matter, when you're reading the work, you might feel that okay, uh, the author who's written this particular work might be like this. This might be his sociological condition. This might be his uh, background. This might be his thought process. He might have been going through this particular phase when he was writing the work. You might come across many ideas or notions about the author, which might or might not be true. In most of the cases, it might be very different from the characteristics of the real author. That is why the uh, term implied author, it's also referred to as inferred author. Okay, implied author or inferred author. Now, why this name is more apt in a way, I would say, inferred, because you you are inferring certain ideas about the author from what you're reading. Okay, so implied author or inferred author. I hope you got the idea. So this is the idea or concepts that you develop about the characteristics of the author, uh, all sorts of characteristics of the author from merely reading his work, which might or might not be uh, co- uh, true about the real author. Okay, so implied author. Now, and so this term was introduced by Wayne C. Booth. This concept was introduced by Wayne C. Booth, and this was used. Remember, this concept was introduced in 1961 by Wayne C. Booth, and it was included in the diagram by Seymour Chapman in the year 1978. So, implied author, when you're reading the narrative text, a reader will get the idea of an implied author, and within the text there will be a narrator who's narrating the story, and the story is narrated to someone, and that someone is called the narratee. And the story is told to the not just to the narratee but also to an implied reader. Now, what do you mean by an implied reader? Again, this is not a real person. This is the person or the reader that was in the mind of the author while he was writing the work. Okay, the intended reader would be the correct term. Implied reader or intended reader, which is not formally used, obviously, but for your better understanding, I just used the term. That is, when an author is writing a work, he might have a particular reader in mind. Yes, uh, for example, tragedies will be enjoyed by a particular group of readers. Romance novels will be enjoyed by a particular group of readers. So when an author is composing, or when an author is writing a particular literary work, he has a particular reader in mind. So that reader is called the implied reader, and that reader might be very different from the real reader, because the it is not in the control of the you know who reads the work is out of the control of the author, right? Once he has written the work, once the work is published, once it's distributed, the author has no control over the distribution of the literary work, right? It might reach a number of people, so that the, it might reach those people who might not fall into the category of the intended readership, right? So the real flesh and blood person who does read the work is called the real reader. So this diagram gives us an idea about how a narrative is constructed. Okay, so there is a real author, there is a real reader, and what connects them is the narrative text. So these three things are real: the author, the real reader, and the narrative text are real. But in between, within the narrative text, there are certain elements which are not explicit, which are not directly out there, which are implicit, which are inside the text. Now, one is the implied order. From reading the work, the idea of the idea of the writer that comes into the mind of the reader is called the implied author. Now, implied author is not the real author; it is a virtual author. Okay, and the story is within the text. The story is told by a particular narrator. It is told to a narratee within the story, and also to the implied reader, that is the reader that was in the mind of who was in the that was in the mind of the author, the intended reader, uh, as far as the author was concerned. So he had this particular reader in mind when he was writing the work. Such a reader is called the implied reader. Okay. Uh, uh, Now all these are virtual characters, right? All these, the implied author is not real, the implied reader is not real. Implied author, the concept of the implied author occurs in the mind of the real reader, and the concept of the implied reader occurs in the mind of the real author, and the narrator and the narratee are characters within the text, right? They are also not real, they are fictional. Okay, so this is the diagram of narrative communication. Very famous, very popular, very effective diagram of narrative communication that was introduced by Seymour Chapman in the year 1978. Now, we'll take a look at the typology of author or narrator as well. The word author comes from the Latin term auctor. Author, as we all know, is someone who creates a particular work. Now, based on the different modes of narration, there are 8 different modes of narration. The In narration, the reader identifies various types of narration carried out by various kinds of narrators. Now, different texts have different kinds of narrators. Narrators do not remain the same, right? So let's take a look at the different kinds of narration that we'll find in text. First one is the heterodiegetic narration. In heterodiegetic narration, the narrator stands outside the story. It can also be referred to as third person narrative or omniscient narration. Yes. Now, what do you mean by this? The person who narrates the story, the narrator, is not a part of the story. Heterodiegetic actually means other telling. So, another person is telling the story, and this other person is not a part of the story. He stands outside the story. It can also be referred to as third person narration or omniscient narration. Omniscient, someone who knows everything. Okay, that is the first kind of narration. Heterodiegetic. Now, in folk tales and fairy tales, when a story starts like once upon a time in a land far, far away, that is omniscient narration. Because the person who is narrating is not a part of the story. Now, the second category is heterodiegetic, intradiegetic narration. Now, the heterodiegetic narrator, we already looked at what heterodiegetic narration is. The narrator is not part of the story. Now, in the second one, heterodiegetic, intradiegetic narration, uh, the narrator is an observer of the story. He is a character in the story, but he remains an observer throughout. He never plays any part. He never gets involved in any of the actions of the story. Okay, that's why he is called a heterodiegetic, intradiegetic narrator. He is a character within the story, but he remains an observer throughout. He never gets involved in the actions of the story. The perfect example of a heterodiegetic, interdiegetic narrator is the character of Mr. Lockwood from Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Now, if you have read Wuthering Heights, you'll understand that it is through the eyes of Mr. Lockwood that the story unfolds. But he never plays any part in the story. He's there in the story, but he does not do anything other than relating to us what has happened to the other characters. Other than that, he is not involved in any of the major action. Now, the third category, homodiegetic narration. Now, homodiegetic is a first person narrator. May the In this particular narration, the narrator is the character in the story and is very much involved in the actions. Right? He is very much involved in the action. It's first person narration. This narrator is involved in all the major actions taking place in the story. Now, fourth category, autodiegetic narration. Now, autobiography. What do you mean by this? The person, the in this particular narration, the narrator is telling their own story or their own personal experience. By Autobiography is a perfect example. Autobiographical fiction. hmm, Uh, when you're writing your own story, that is autodiegetic narration, when you're telling your own story or your own personal experience. Now, fifth one, first person omniscient. It's a special kind of narration where the narrator is a character in the story but knows the thoughts and feelings of all the other characters, which is logically not possible, right? Uh, a normal human being cannot mm, cannot analyze or cannot understand or cannot know what is exactly going through the minds of other people around him or her. Right? So this is a special kind of narration uh, where the character in the story uh, is the narrator. He is involved in all the actions, but he's given certain special powers and privileges by the writer. In that he knows he's in that he is omniscient. That is, he knows what is going through the minds of all the other characters. Now, alternating personal view. Now, this is another rare form of narration where the narration moves back and forth between third person omniscient narrator to the first person narrator. That is, in this particular narration, some part of the narration would be done by third person omniscient narrator. That is, our heterodiegetic narrator. An omniscient narrator who's not a part of the story will do some part of the narration, and then it will later move on to the first person narrator. That is Homo diegetic narration. Okay, this is a special, very rare kind of narration. This is not often found. In fact, the example that is given is that of the Harry Potter series. You'll remember, if you have read Harry Potter, you'll remember that most of it is done in the third person omniscient form. The story is told by someone who is not present in the who's not part of the story, who's not present, but at certain instances it goes to the first person. The story is told through the eyes of the first person narrator. Now, the remaining two you are already aware, a stream of consciousness voice. In certain works, especially novels written by Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, stream of consciousness technique is also used. You get to know the thoughts and feelings and the ideas going through the mind of the protagonist. Yes, that kind of narration is also there. Now, eighth one, the epistolary voice. Epistolary, uh, as the name suggests, uses letters and other types of documents to convey the plot of a story. A major example would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where the story unfolds in the through the in the form of letters. So that is the eighth form of narration. I think with that we can wind up this particular video.